From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. The K-State Plant Diagnostic Lab received the first sudden death syndrome infected soybean plants several weeks ago, and K-State plant pathologist Doug Jardine was a little surprised. While the symptoms of SDS are easily recognizable, he says the first step is making sure it is sudden death syndrome. We'll hear more from Doug in a moment. Also, more from Jason Clay, Vice President for Markets and Food at the World Wildlife Fund and the latest speaker in the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture Series. Audience participation is part of that series. We'll hear some of the questions Clay was asked and how he responded to those often pointed questions. Ward Upham is in with Eric for this week's horticulture segment, and I'll have the latest agricultural news. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. The first sudden death syndrome infected soybean plants arrived in the K-State Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab the week of August 21st. The first 2 samples originated in Cherokee and Johnson counties. Since then, the lab has received samples from Coffee County. K-State Research and Extension plant pathologist Doug Jardine says the symptoms of SDS are easily recognizable. However, he says the first step is making sure that it is sudden death syndrome. Doug, there's been some signs of sudden death syndrome in soybeans in Kansas, really in the last couple of weeks, you say.
Yeah, Jeff, we've been getting some samples into the clinic, and really it's kind of interesting because I was not anticipating that we would see a tremendous amount of sudden death this year. We need to kind of go back and just talk about the weather conditions that favor that a little bit. Sudden death syndrome is a disease that sometimes is jokingly referred to as good grower syndrome because it seems like the more you baby a field with nutrients and water and keep the diseases and insects down, the more that field becomes prone to sudden death syndrome. So one of the key components we know is typically wet soils early in the season, and then during the rest of the vegetative stage, it really doesn't matter too much. But then as we get into the reproductive stages, when the soybeans start to flower and set pods, if it starts getting really wet again, then that seems to be some trigger to the fungus, and sudden death syndrome is caused by a fungus that lives in the soil. It's a fusarium fungus, and there's, of course, many fusariums that are plant pathogens, but this is a specific one, the soybeans. And so anyways, there's some trigger in those wet soils that will start the disease off. And interestingly enough, when you see symptoms above ground, you're not actually seeing the fungus directly. The fungus remains in the roots, and it produces a toxin, and that toxin's translocated from the root system up to the upper part of the plants, and those are the symptoms that you actually see. And the word sudden comes because this occurs maybe over about a week's time. You'll first start to see some small kind of cream-colored, or sometimes we call them chlorotic spots in the leaves. And then over a few days, those spots will start to come together. And typically, it's always going to be between the veins. So you're going to end up first with kind of yellow streaking where the veins remain green. And then those yellow areas will actually turn brown or die off, or sometimes you read literature, we'll call it necrosis. Anyways, death of the tissue. And so you'll get these streaks of brown in the leaves, but again, the veins remain very green. That in itself, would suggest sudden death syndrome, but there are at least 3 or 4 other problems that can occur in soybeans that cause the same symptoms. So it's important to do a little bit more investigative work. Probably the most common other possibility here in Kansas of seeing those green veins with dying tissue between them is a stem disease called stem canker. Occasionally, it gets pretty severe in Kansas, but at least this year, we've seen very little of it. It likes very hot, humid weather. You'll usually see it in low spots in the field, but it can give those similar foliar symptoms. Another disease that can cause similar foliar symptoms is one called brown stem rot. And that's actually a disease that's very rare in Kansas. It's what we would refer to as a cool weather disease. It's usually a problem in Wisconsin and Minnesota, northern Iowa, northern Nebraska, because it likes cooler days and cooler nights. And typically in a Kansas summer, we don't get that. On the rare occasion that we do see it, honestly, it's up along the Nebraska border. It's been years since I've seen it, but I think the last time we saw it was probably in Republic County. And then the last one that can give a similar symptom is actually a fungicide problem. If we use one of the triazole fungicides, things like Tilt, it would be a good example of one that's been around forever that people would be familiar with, or some of the tebuconazole products, which is the old Folicure, but now is known by many different generic names. If we apply those on days when the temperature is pushing 100 degrees, we will get a foliar burn, and it'll look just like sudden death syndrome. And we've seen that in Kansas, occasionally. But we don't do a lot of foliar spraying of soybeans because really the only foliar disease that's mostly treatable in Kansas is frog eye leaf spot, and that's, again, kind of a hit-or-miss disease. So we need to rule those other problems out. And so the question is, how do we do that? And you need to extract the roots from the soil, and you need to split the lower stem and the taproot. On a healthy soybean plant, or if it has one of these other problems, it's going to be white, okay, or just a very off-color white. When we have sudden death syndrome, it's going to take on a grayish or brownish appearance. It'll be quite noticeable, and if you had a healthy plant next to an infected plant side by side, it's pretty obvious. So, one of the keys to sudden death then, is we're kind of bring this all, wrap it up, is to know that you actually have it and it's not one of these other problems.
And you said that you were somewhat surprised to see it this year.
Well, yeah, because if you look at the recent drought monitor map, very large portions of south central, north central, even into northeast Kansas are under some abnormal to moderate drought. And these are the same areas that kind of overlap with our historical locations for sudden death syndrome. If we kind of picture a map of Kansas in our head, sudden death syndrome is associated with our major river valleys. So that would be the Kansas River Valley, the Republican River Valley, and the Arkansas River Valley. So those are the places where we would most often find it. And I guess I should throw in the Missouri River, because along Donovan, Atchison, Leavenworth counties along the Missouri River, those have traditionally been hot spots. So, being that it's been dry in those areas, I really wasn't anticipating it much. And in the last few weeks, we've started getting samples in from Johnson County and Coffee County and Cherokee County. Johnson is a traditional location because, again, that's associated with the Kansas River Valley, but we were really quite surprised to see it coming out of Cherokee County and most recently Coffee County. We have had a sample from Cherokee County before, but it wasn't common. But this year, all of a sudden, we had 4 or 5 in 1 week. If we go back and look at the weather records back about mid-August, around the 14th or 15th of August, those locations were getting 3, 4, 5, 6 inches of rain. Some people may remember the flooding that was going on over in the Kansas City area. And those same rains that caused the flooding over in Kansas City apparently were enough to set off the sudden death syndrome symptoms, even on more upland types of soil. So the fact that we're seeing it now, if you go back and study the problem a little bit closer, I guess it's a little bit less surprising. The other thing I want to remind people is that this particular disease is highly associated with soybean cyst nematode. And so fields that have healthy levels of soybean cyst nematode tend to be more prone to sudden death syndrome. Now, as I say that, we've talked about this before. We did about 5 years ago, we completed a soybean cyst nematode survey of the state, and Cherokee County was the number one most infested county in the state for soybean cyst nematode. At that time, 95% of the fields we sampled had detectable levels of soybean cyst nematode. So when you think about that, then that makes it a little less surprising. That's where we're seeing the disease. I think historically we haven't seen a lot down there because, they have very shallow clay pan soils, and the old joke is you're never more than 24 hours from a flood or 10 days from a drought, because when the rains come, they get a lot of runoff, and then it's typically hot and doesn't rain a lot in August down there, and so they dry out very quickly. But I think over time now, sudden death is finally getting established down in those fields. And so when we have these wetter soil conditions, particularly in the August time frame, I guess it's not surprising that we're seeing more of it these days.
What's the best line of defense then?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because it's kind of a three-pronged attack. First of all, you need to manage soybean cyst nematode. We know that 99% of the varieties claim resistance to cyst nematode, but they don't all work equally well in individual fields. And so you need to get on a soil testing program to know what your numbers are and make sure that the varieties you're using are driving that number down. Secondly, there are sudden death syndrome tolerant varieties. Every company pretty much provides ratings of some sort for sudden death syndrome tolerance. You really can't compare ratings across companies because they have their own idea of what a 1 is or what a 2 is or what a 5 is. But within a company, you can pick out their best varieties and preferably one that you know is going to perform well. And then lastly, as of a year or two ago, there is a new seed treatment that was introduced into the market. It's called Ilevo. In our university trials here at Kansas State and at other universities, it performs really well against sudden death syndrome. It doesn't eliminate it, but we've seen as much as 5 to 10 bushel yield increases in heavily infested fields. The problem with that product is it's pretty expensive, and we don't recommend it just as a prophylactic use in a field that you have no idea that you have sudden death. But if you have a field with a known history, it would be worth the investment.
And you have some publications and some information on this if people need it?
There are a number of places you can go on the web. A few years ago, we put together a regional sudden death syndrome publication. There are links to it on the K-State Extension Plant Pathology page, or if they just Google soybean sudden death syndrome, it will pop up near the top. And it's a good 8 or 10 page color publication that would have all the information they need in it. But we do have links from our K-State Extension Plant Pathology page to it.
That's K-State Research and Extension Plant Pathologist Doug Jardine. Historical yield losses from sudden death syndrome in soybeans generally range from 1 to 25%. Agriculture Today continues after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
Listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. The Vice President for Markets and Food at the World Wildlife Fund, Jason Clay, says that as the world's population continues to increase, we'll need to produce as much food in the next 40 years as we have in the last 8,000 years. And we'll have to do it with less land, less water, and fewer inputs. In delivering the fourth lecture in the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems lecture series at Kansas State University earlier this week, Clay fielded a number of questions from the audience, something that's unique to this lecture series. For timing purposes, we've had to condense the question and answer session, but Clay's address and the entire Q&A session is available on Kansas State University's Global Food Systems webpage at www.k-state.edu/globalfood.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Clay. But my first question is, there's no question that food and animal production is more efficient and more sustainable when in confinement. Producers have more control over their inputs and outputs, but the social pressures from an uninformed consumer continue to send signals about grass-fed, range-fed, and other ideas. Will the World Wildlife Fund be an advocate for food animal producers and use their large voice to educate and inform the consumer with a strong message that eliminating confined operations is not a sustainable solution?
We're actually interested in what are the most efficient ways to produce food. And that means looking at what the science is on this. And my sense is that to date, the data suggests that grass-fed beef has high greenhouse gas emissions, and that long-term confined animal feeding has other types of greenhouse gas emissions, and that somewhere in between is probably the best option. But the data is getting better all the time. And the one thing that I think is going to be interesting is that there is data now that suggests that there is more carbon sequestered in grasslands in the Midwest and in the steppes of Russia than there is in many tropical forests. And so converting that to cropland is something that we wouldn't want to see, and actually having cattle on that may be the best way to actually maintain those carbon stocks. So it's a complicated issue, and I think we just need to be using the science to really look at how we think about that. And reasonable people are going to disagree about this one.
There's a lot of misinformation, particularly in social media, about the goals and intent of the World Wildlife Fund as it relates to Kansas's grassroots agriculture. You've been quoted, "By companies asking for this, we can leverage production so much faster than by waiting for consumers to do it." How can farmers and ranchers be confident the WWF partnerships with the corporate world will not result in an agenda that forces mandated expenses largely expected to be absorbed by producers?
So I think that the goal here is to figure out how to make all production, or at least those producers who want to be engaged in these kind of programs, more sustainable. Any standards that are created have the input of those producers in them, so they're not written by companies at all. They're never actually part, or rarely part of those groups. They're part of them at a political level, but they're not the technical people as scientists that are designing those systems. And I think it's important to kind of get that out on the table. If producers want to be involved and want to be part of this, then they should take responsibility for being in those roundtables and helping figure out what the standards ought to be. And this is where you need to figure out what you agree on, what you disagree on, and what you don't know enough about. So I think that is what's driving this. In terms of our partnerships with companies, if producers are going to go to the trouble to make changes and to produce a better quality product or produce it in a more sustainable way, we want to make sure that there's actually a market for it. And we want to make sure that there's always more demand than there is supply, because that's the only way a producer has any chance of getting a premium, even in the short term. So by creating more demand than supply, I mean, this is what I learned in rainforest marketing and stuff. You always want to have 2 to 3 times more demand than there is supply, just so that those producers that want to do this, want to take part, the willing, can actually get access to those markets.
How do these issues specifically translate to modern food production for grassroots producers? So, for example, several years ago, the National Beef Quality Audit revealed problems leading to losses up the food chain due to injection sites. More losses occurred due to high damage created by iron branding. So, over time, the beef industry has worked to inform and educate producers relative to reducing those losses by changing how we do things. The result has been a win-win. So in the future, will the World Wildlife Fund go as far as to recommend specific changes?
I think what you're talking about is a system that was set up, and then once that system was set up, producers actually could learn from each other about what the costs were of not doing it, as well as the cost of actually doing it. So the one place that I would say all of us have not done a good job is actually helping set up systems where producers can learn from each other much more quickly and share information more quickly and do site visits and go understand firsthand how somebody else has addressed an issue. We just haven't done that as well as we should. The Midwest Row Crop Collaborative is doing that around soil and just starting with 100 different farmers sharing their data with other farmers around soy and corn row crops in Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. I haven't seen anything like that for beef yet, but I think it would be good. We've got to figure out how to use the 21st century tools to actually improve production, and IT is one of those tools that is really underutilized right now.
Thanks so much, Dr. Clay. As the world's premier land-grant university, I'm sure we have a lot to offer as far as solutions go to this issue. But as an institution, I'm sure we're also committed to a variety of ways that promulgate the problem, commit ourselves to business as usual. So I think we'd all appreciate it if you could maybe give some specific critiques of how universities like ours aren't incentivized to really focus on sustainability and like I said, keep focusing on business as usual, because I'm sure our students and our faculty would like to create the social change necessary at our institution in order to adequately contribute to the problems we talked about today. Thanks.
It's interesting, and I went to a land-grant university for my PhD. I was at Cornell. It seems to me that land-grant universities have become so cumbersome that it's very hard for them to be innovative. And yet, now is the time that we need innovation more than ever. And how can we, with all the overheads associated with universities, how can we use little bits of money to test new things and kill them when they don't work, or move them forward if they do? How can we do that more in an entrepreneurial way? I think we've got to figure out how to bring that spirit back into universities, because once you add on whatever your overhead rate is here, I don't know what it is, but once you start adding all these things on, everything just kind of grinds to a halt. And I would also say that the people who are often very good at fundraising in universities aren't necessarily the people that are going to be the most innovative in terms of the problems they're looking at or how they're looking at them. And we've got to figure out how to link these two together a little more. There are certainly plenty of problems that we need innovation on, and I think plenty of ways that universities can get engaged in them. But part of it is to let students and faculty and grad students and postdocs and everybody begin to experiment a bit more with this and see where we can come. Taking this totally out of the university context, we can't work on 100 problems right now. It's just humanly impossible to work on 100 things. If we can agree on 3 to 5 things, we can move the needle, whether we're in a university, an NGO, in a company, whatever. So let's agree on the 3 to 5 things. K-State could agree on the 3 to 5 things it wants to really work on. You've got a lab on sustainable intensification. That's a good start. You've got a lab on post-harvest losses. That's a big area. Let's do it. Let's move those forward. But how can we do that in a really innovative way? What I see in terms of innovation in my world is I every year survey hundreds of people from different companies about what are the trends. One of the biggest trends now is that companies are investing less in R&D because there's too many things that they're interested in and they don't have enough money to cover them all. So it's easier just to go buy what they need. But even there, have we ever really thought about having a pre-competitive approach to venture capital? Could we have a prize to solve a problem and a bunch of venture capitalists agree to put money in to fund every horse in the race? Because even a horse that doesn't win can come up with a really good idea and a really good thing that's going to go to market and actually do something for somebody. So I think we just need to get much more focused in our work on this. I don't know if that exactly answers your question about K-State and what you can do, but I don't think it's just about K-State. I think it's about a whole system that we're involved in that needs to be broken a bit, to be unfrozen, and to move forward.
That's Jason Clay, Vice President for Markets and Food at the World Wildlife Fund. He delivered the 4th lecture in the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems lecture series at Kansas State University earlier this week. Kansas State University established the lecture series in 2015 to provide science-based education about world food issues. You can hear the entire Q&A session as well as Clay's address by going to Kansas State University's Global Food Systems webpage, www.k-state.edu/globalfood. Agriculture Today is back after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wickman. In today's agricultural news, according to Politico, Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue last week announced some changes to USDA offices and programs as part of his ongoing effort to streamline bureaucracy, improve efficiency, and make it, as he likes to say, more customer-friendly. Under elements of his plan, the department is combining domestic farm services into a single mission area, organizing trade-related initiatives under the newly created Undersecretary for Trade position, and eliminating the Rural Development Mission area by moving those programs into the portfolio of a newly created assistant to the Secretary. The U.S. Codex Office, which deals with aligning international standards, will be moved from the Food Safety and Inspection Service to the Trade Mission area. The International Food Commodity Procurement Program, currently housed within the Farm Service Agency, will be moved to merge with the Domestic Commodity Food Procurement Program under the Agricultural Marketing Service. Purdue's reshuffling will also create a Rural Development Initiative Center to evaluate the effectiveness of the business, housing, and utilities programs that the department provides. Producers with a written prevention and response plan for an animal disease outbreak may, according to one expert, have a form of insurance. Rod Bain has more.
The potential of an animal disease outbreak and the related economic hardship it could cause for a livestock or poultry operation is why producers need a written prevention and response plan to such incidents.
If you were to get an influenza outbreak on poultry or a PED outbreak on swine, it will cost perhaps into the hundreds of thousands of dollars for an individual farmer. They're going to lose revenue for several months perhaps. Then there's cleanup of dead animals. So it's an increased cost, decreased revenue if you're the one with the outbreak.
University of Missouri Extension economist Ray Massey explains a written plan is similar to an insurance policy, and that having one will prove valuable when an outbreak impacted producer needs financing to keep in business.
There needs to be this written plan of how to keep it from happening, and then if it does happen, how do I control it or deal with it?
Massey says such a biosecurity plan should include potential hazard assessment, management strategies that factor in possible contingencies or flexibilities, and the costs related to prevention and response. Now, where such a plan can serve as insurance for producers in the event of an animal disease outbreak is in this regard.
The key thing is not just that you have it in writing and that you have these contingencies, this flexibility, but that you share it with different people that are going to be involved in it.
Which means, from the economic perspective, a bank or lending institution.
Prepare the plan and then share it with the banker saying, hey, I have an idea of how to get through this, but I need essentially a promissory note or a line of credit in case this happens so that you're aware of it, so that he knows what the expenses are likely to be and how long you're likely to be needing a line of credit.
Similar communication about a written animal disease outbreak plan, well before such an incident were to ever occur, is also important when it pertains to the businesses that provide contracted inputs and services to an operation, such as feed. Massey says this makes it easier for a producer to stay operating and cover expenses during an outbreak.
So there is just a huge amount of communication of that plan. It just doesn't sit on the shelf, but it is shared with all the different parties that are going to be involved in it.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Well, one weather analyst says that he was only very mildly surprised that USDA raised its production forecast for soybeans and corn. Gary Crawford reports.
Some people may have been surprised by USDA raising its yield and production forecasts this month after August estimates were already surprisingly high. For example, USDA upping its soybean forecast Tuesday by another 1%. However,
you should never be surprised about these late season bumps in soybean numbers.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says in years past, when weather's been like this season, unusually cool and moist,
soybeans have performed fabulously in recent years.
USDA also raised its corn forecast by a little, 32 million bushels, less than 1%, but Rippey told us
corn may be a little bit more of a surprise, and you have to probably slice and dice down to the state level to get into the fine details, but the bottom line, again, is we went through an entire season with little, if any, heat stress.
Well, the biggest increase from last month's forecast, cotton, USDA bumping that up 6%, and Rippey says that might have been a surprise.
Probably things were better all along with cotton than what anybody really realized.
The forecasts all could change, though, when we're able to measure the effects of Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And now here with this week's Kansas soybean update is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Dan Neenan is the director of the National Education Center for Agricultural Safety. And Dan, coming up during the month of September is National Farm Safety and Health Week. And there's a lot to talk about. And there's a lot to think about, too, as far as not only your health, but the safety on the farm.
Agriculture is continuing to be one of the most dangerous industries in the United States. Last year we have data for was 2015, in which there were 570 fatalities and another 70,000 disabling injuries. So we've got some work to do when it comes to health and safety on the farm.
National Farm Safety and Health Week is September 17th through the 23rd, and it looks at so many aspects of it: tractor safety, farmer health, child youth health and safety, confined spaces in agriculture, and rural roadway safety. In other words, it's pretty much everyday occurrence and pretty much being safe throughout the entire time.
Absolutely. I mean, if you take a look at numbers, tractor safety is by far the number one source of injuries and fatalities on the farm in America. But there's a lot of different ways that folks can get themselves in trouble. Of those 570 fatalities in 2015, about 100 of them were kids under the age of 18. So that's kind of what the Wednesday focus is taking a look at. Child and youth safety when they're on the farm. And, of course, rural roadway safety is something not only for the farmer, but we need to take a look at the motoring public as well. As we get into the fall, the days get shorter, of course, and at harvest time, we're going to have a lot of equipment on the roadway. So we need to share the roadway, but there's a couple things that the motoring public needs to know. You can't pass a piece of farm equipment in a no-passing zone, even if they're going slower than what you are, and to always be aware of tractors with wagons and combines making left-hand turns into farm fields. We have a lot of incidents where, the farm equipment's turning and somebody's trying to pass and a collision occurs.
Are farmers getting better at practicing farm safety and keeping up with their health?
As we purchase new equipment, the new equipment has today's safety standards on it. So in that way, we're getting better. If you take a look at it, when I first started in farm safety and health back in 2000, we were averaging 740, 750 fatalities. So we're heading in the right direction, but unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to reach zero during my working lifetime.
Dan, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That is Dan Neenan, who's the director of the National Education Center for Agricultural Safety. He's been our guest on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
And that's a look at today's agricultural news. Agriculture Today continues after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly K-State horticulture segment. And yes, we're now embarking on that part of the fall when you can successfully establish or overseed a cool season lawn. And there are very important steps to accomplishing either of those that we want to get into today with Ward Upham. He's a research and extension horticulturist at K-State. There is a fairly wide time window for seeding or overseeding a lawn in the fall, but it has its limitations as well, does it not, Ward?
It certainly does. And so when we're talking about cool season grasses, we're talking about tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass. Well, Kentucky bluegrass is slower growing and takes longer to germinate. And so we want to have our new seed in there by the end of this month, by the end of September. Tall fescue is quicker to germinate, and therefore we can push that back as far as mid-October. Now, the sooner you do it, the better, just because you'll have a more mature lawn by the time you get into cold weather, and then that gets it off to a good start the next spring.
Now, you list 3 keys to succeeding with this project, and you want folks to emphasize and adhere to each and every one of them, starting with seeding rates.
Yeah, seeding rates differs between tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass just because tall fescue is a much larger seed. Therefore, we need about 6 to 8 pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet on tall fescue, but only 2 to 3 pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet on Kentucky bluegrass. If you get over that, you can make that grass so competitive with one another that it can weaken it. If you're under that, it can be a thin lawn. And so we want to make sure we get that seeding right correct.
And then being sure that that seed does come in firm contact with the soil itself, right?
That is very, very important. If you just scatter seed on top of the soil, you're not going to get a good stand. There has to be a little bit of mixing there, but it has to be shallow. If you get it too deep, that seed will not come through. And so if you do this properly, you're going to see some seed on top of the soil. That's fine, because that means that other seed is in good contact with the soil. And if it is, it will come up quickly.
And some of this has to do with soil preparation, which we'll talk about, and, of course, watering that new lawn. And that is an absolute essential here.
It certainly is. So before you even seed, if you have dry soil, you need to water well to get that water down at least 6 to 8 inches deep. And then let it dry out enough that you can work the soil. That way, when those new seedlings start to grow, they get roots down into that moist soil. If it's dry underneath, they're never going to go down. And so make sure you have properly watered soil before you start. Now, once you've got that seed down, you need to keep it moist.
Sure.
And so we're probably talking about maybe once or possibly twice a day if we have a windy day that's really warm. But make sure you keep that soil moist but not waterlogged. If you have standing water, that's just as bad as not having enough.
But pre-watering is just as critical as watering after seeding, so keep that well in mind here. Now, you note that those that have a thick layer of thatch on their lawn currently may have to contend with that somehow to achieve that seed-to-soil contact.
That's right. If you only have a 1/4 inch of thatch, you're fine. That's not going to hurt anything. Actually, it acts like a mulch and may actually help some things. When you get over that, it may have trouble getting through that thatch and getting good contact between the seed and the soil. And so in those cases, if you're a little bit over a 1/4 of an inch, you may want to use one of those methods called core aerating. That'll punch through the thatch and get that seed in good contact with the soil. If you get up to about 3/4 of an inch of thatch, it is often better just to strip it all off and establish a new lawn. It's just really difficult to get that seed down to where it needs to be.
But here we're talking about overseeding, so contend with that thatch as is necessary. Does one also need to pre-seeding or at seeding apply a fertilizer?
You certainly do. And so what you want to use is a starter fertilizer, which is going to have more phosphorus than nitrogen or potassium. So just look for a bag that says starter fertilizer and apply it at the rate they suggest.
And mow that existing grass short if overseeding, you say?
Yes. And remember, if you have primarily a good lawn and just some bare spots or a place right next to the sidewalk that's a little bit thin, you don't have to do the whole thing. All you need to do is that area that really needs to be thickened up. Mm-hmm. And so that area you want to mow short and collect the clippings. That will help you get good contact again between the seed and the soil because you don't have near as much grass to contend with. Mm-hmm. And then we have different methods. You know, there are different ways of actually getting good contact between the seed and the soil.
You mentioned one already, core aerating.
That's core aerating. Another one is verticut. And so this is a verticut machine which has little, almost like knives, that'll make grooves in the soil into which that seed can fall. And so you go over it with a verticut and then put down your seed. A lot of people go over it a second time, only a little bit different angle. And that gets that seed worked in just a little bit. A slit seeder is the same thing as a verticut, except it has a seed hopper. And so you do that in one operation. Where the verticut, you have to broadcast after you're done verticutting. With this one, it does it in one operation. And then we mentioned core aerating, but you need to go over that area 3 times. You can't just go over it once. Those holes have to be close enough together that those new seedlings will fill in well. Mm-hmm. And so go over it 3 times and you'll be fine. Of those 3, I prefer slit seeding. That is the one that I think does the best job.
In terms of soil contact?
In terms of soil contact and getting a good stand. When you core aerate, you get the little tufts of grass. They do fill in, but they get little tufts of grass. However, if you're in an area where you can't water very much or you're on a slope, it may be better to go with a core aerator just because it doesn't need as much water to get that seed up. Those seeds fall into those holes, and it naturally stays more moist.
Now, there may be the case where a lawn is so far gone that it needs to be redone entirely, and that means tilling the side up completely?
It can. You know, it may mean that you go in with something like Roundup and kill everything out and then use one of these other methods. But in some cases, that's not going to work, and you're going to have to rototill. In those cases, you need to pack that soil back down, run over it with like a lawn tractor or something like that, broadcast your seed, and then use something to work it in. What I like to use is a leaf rake. That is about the right type of instrument to use in order to get that seed lightly mixed into the soil.
And once you've done that, you follow generally the same procedures as overseeding, correct?
Yes, it is. So there's really not a lot of difference between how you do either one. Just remember, good seed-soil contact, do a good job of watering, fertilize before you put it down, and you should be good.
So follow these steps as Ward has outlined them for us today to succeeding with fall, cool season lawn seeding. Ward, thank you for coming over once again.
You bet.
That's Ward Upham, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension, on this K-State Horticulture segment for the week. That brings our Thursday edition to a close, and thanks for tuning in. For Jeff Wickman, Eric Atkinson here, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.